Okay, welcome to the Nations of Sanity. It's my great pleasure to be speaking with Robert Wenzel again. I spoke to him I think it was about a year ago, maybe two, and we had a very long but very interesting discussion about his private property society, which is his vision of a free society based on private property. And I obviously discussed my project, which is the Nations of Sanity project, which is an idea of creating a free society based on the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as the universal law through a peace agreement. And for anybody that wants to, I'll put a link in the description for anyone who wants to have a look at our original conversation, as we obviously went into great detail about our respective ideas and projects. We're going to be talking about a few subjects in this conversation. But first of all, I'm going to hand it over to Robert just to speak about how the COVID situation would be affected and how that would play out in the society he proposes. And I'm sure he's got a few other things to say about the subject. So hand it over to you, Robert. And thank you
hi,
for
Matthew.
being with me.
Sure, thank you. From a private property perspective, I put much emphasis on individuals and they're controlling what they want to do on their private property. So the current COVID situation for me is horrific with regard to the draconian measures being taken by government. Because first of all, I don't think they've got the science right. It seems very, very odd, some of the things they're doing. They do not seem to be studying science or anything like that. They're just coming out with a lot of orders that are inconsistent. And I've been discussing this from the beginning. Your man in London, Ferguson, at the Imperial College, when he put out the paper and said that 2 million people would die in the United States and I guess 500,000 in the UK, within 48 hours, I questioned his paper and pointed out problems with the paper. So that's kind of the problems I see with government when you have a situation where they sort of take one vision and apply it to everyone. And it may not be an accurate vision. Now, to the degree that we know at this point, it seems that you can protect yourself from the virus if you shelter in place. So I have no problem with anyone who wants to shelter in place and protect themselves from the virus. On the other hand, if someone wants to go out, venture out, go to the beach with 1,000 other people on the beach, not wearing a mask and not observing any social distancing, I don't have any problem with that. It's their life, and if they are willing to take that risk, I don't have problems with it. I see what government is doing in a bizarre kind of fashion is taking a one-size-fits-all version of risk. In my view, all kinds of people take all kinds of risks. There are people who parachute, hang glide, not too far from here. I would never do any of that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, I like to wander into the dangerous parts of town just to see what's going on. It's kind of interesting. It's a safari for me. And there's a lot of people that would not do that and think I'm crazy for doing that. So everybody has their own risk profile. Some people are very risk averse. I mean, I see people walking on the street with the mask on and the shield. The other day, I went to the corner. In Northern California, you don't have to wear a mask outside. They just changed that rule in San Francisco. But up until yesterday, you didn't have to wear a mask outside. So I always keep mine down. I put it on when I go into a store where it's required. But I stood at a street corner, and there was a woman that was at least 6 feet, which is the social distance rule. She was 6 feet away from me and wearing a mask, but she saw I wasn't and sort of stepped another 4 feet away. So if she wants to do that, that's fine with me. However, I don't really consider the risk of the virus to be that serious. If you really look, the majority of people, the overwhelming number of people that are severely impacted by the disease are elderly people with some type of serious illness. Over 40%, maybe as many as 50% of people in the United States that have died from the virus died in nursing homes. Now, the question of how the nursing home care was done is a whole other question, but it's not something that should be really of concern to the general public. And I could go on. I've got a new podcast I'm launching called This Week in Economics with Robert Wenzel, and I discuss risk. And what's going on is there's something called dread risk, where people sort of get bombarded with news about some kind of thing that's killing a lot of people or causing some kind of problem. And they become more concerned about that than they do about other risks, which may be as great. For example, driving in your car is really not that much of a difference in risk in terms of dying and someone under 65 getting the virus and dying from the virus. I mean, there's hardly any difference. However, because you're bombarded with all this news, you're much more likely to fear it, especially if people who focus more on emotions versus the logical part. So I think that's one thing that happened, and I discuss it in more detail. But the scientists, the psychologists that developed it, I just happen to have his book here, is Gerd Geigerzer. I probably butchered the name a little bit, but a German who was head of the research at Max Planck Institute in Berlin. So he's a serious guy. And there was a guy by the name of Paul Stojic who originally came up with the term dread risk, and Gergenzizer tweeted it a little bit. So it's understandable in terms of what's going on now. And he wrote this book in 2014 before this virus came out. So he was just talking about this in general. So I think what's happened is that there's a large amount of the community that developed this dread risk fear. And then what happened is you got something else called herd risk. When almost everybody fears something, or a lot of people, the whole herd tends to fear it. And now I would say it's 98, 99% of the people out there fear it. And I don't see it. I mean, if you look at the numbers rationally, it's not a serious threat to people under 65, under 70. Some people are asymptomatic. Some people get minor symptoms. Some people get flu-like symptoms. I guess some people could say they get severe flu-like symptoms, but it's not something that is really that much different than any other flu. So it's emotional things going on versus people who have that strong ability to focus on logic and understand the situation. So that's my take on the COVID. So getting back to the private property society, none of this would happen in the private property society, because the private property society is you make your rules on your property. So if somebody over there says, wear a mask, wear a whole germ suit, whatever, they're free to do that. But if there's someone else, someone like me, who's not that concerned about this particular virus, I would say, hey, come on over and let's party. And that would be it. So what happens is with government, I really consider these people really power freaks, because on top of whether the question is whether there's any severe threat with this virus, some of the rules they are making make no sense at all. And it appears to me they're just power freak rules. They're destroying. Actually, it's kind of interesting because I'm a private property society anarchist. I don't really mind government shrinking, but they're by closing down so much of government, they're shutting down their own revenues. So they're gonna have to start cutting government all over the place. So I kind of find that humorous, especially here in San Francisco, because this is a tourist city and she's spooking tourists, and no one's coming here. The revenues are going to drop dramatically. So London Breed, who is the mayor, is doing some very, very strange things.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is, I get what you're saying. The flip side of that, though, is the more businesses they're ruining, the more people are going to potentially be dependent on government, which might
Yeah.
call for a lot. You know, they might be, although
Yeah.
I can, you know what I mean. So it could work both ways in that sense.
Yeah, well, Matt, I wrote an article where I said, you know, the worst thing that Trump ever did is set up a situation where he's paying everyone that's out of work $600 in addition to local unemployment, because there are a lot of people now that are actually making more money unemployed than if they were working. And the danger with that is they're sitting fat and happy. This runs out July 31st, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens after July 31st. But he's really taken away a lot of the pressure on, for example, the mayor here, San Francisco, London Breed, and the Oakland mayor, Libby Schaaf, and the California governor, Gavin Newsom. They feel no pressure because the people aren't putting pressure on them because they're sitting at home fat and happy collecting these checks. If Trump never put out these checks, there would be enormous pressure to open up the. So he's kind of actually bailing out the cities and states to make his economy look worse, which is not a bright thing to do.
Yeah, but I think he's put himself in that position a little bit with the lockdown, because he's almost. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I agree. But the problem is I think because if you're going to force people to not go to work, then you kind of have to give them the money, you know what I mean, the money to compensate for the fact that they're not going to work. Otherwise, you can't force, you know what I mean, if the government forced people not to go to work and didn't give them anything, you'd have you know what I mean, you'd have starving people. So,
right. Yeah. So my argument is, and I may write this up as a piece, that the way that Trump can get out of this, because see what happens if he stops making the payments, all these people are going to be mad at him. On the other hand, if he continues them, the whole economy is collapsing, and these governors and local officials can keep these lockdowns on and make the economy look bad for him with our election. So one thing I suggested is that he only continue making payments in states where they're starting to ease on the lockdown, because if they're making the payments, it makes it more comfortable for the state and local officials to keep the lockdown on, because they're not going to have these protests. But if you say, okay, I will give you these payments if you're unemployed in a city or state where the lockdown is being eased, so that makes it creates the incentive to open it up. Another thing, and this is a little flip, and now I'm getting into the 1% of 1% who would actually support me on this. I mean, I'm usually way out there, but this one's even further than normal. What Trump should really do is just open up the city, declare a national emergency, say we're destroying our economy. I order it open up. There's to be no more lockdowns. If anybody wants to self-isolate, and if they're over 65, you know, we've got a website we're setting up. We will deliver food, anything else that's required of you that you need. And what's going to happen is we'll see how long the virus stays. So the scientists, you study any scientist that really understands these viruses, and they will tell you it's 2 weeks up, 2 weeks down, and then it's basically over. So we're going to open up the cities and states with this national order. In addition, I am going to open up airline travel from overseas, especially from countries like Brazil, which are in peak virus now, so that the virus gets over here and we get herd immunity as quickly as possible. Again, if you're concerned about this, you know, stay home and self-isolate for the next 3 or 4 weeks, but it's going to be over very shortly, and we'll be a protected country.
Yeah, I mean, I think he needed to do something like that from the beginning. I think the problem is I think he's created some problems, or, you know, the governments as a whole have created problems for themselves, because it's not just the stopping and reopening of the economy, it's the knock-on effect. Because for so many businesses, it's not just like you can stop the economy, have everything closed down, then start it up and everyone just carries on as they were going. Many businesses are actually going to be put out of business because of this, and then the knock, you know what I mean? So it's created from what they've done initially. Even though I can see the logic in what you're saying to try and fix the problem, because it's all very well saying, oh, we should have done that and it's too late. You know, we still need to find a solution going forward. But it really, that is not a helpful observation. I do think the obvious observation is that's the sort of thing that should have been incorporated from the beginning. Like, they should have had that attitude of, look, we'll look after the people that need to self-isolate and allow other people to kind of carry on as and when they can. And like you say, a little bit like you say with how it will be with your private property society, let people make their own choices in that regard, you know, because the people that want to isolate can do so. I mean, a perfect example is over here, because obviously I have to carry on working. I have a grandmother who has to self-isolate because she's like a vulnerable person and that. My dad gives, you know, drops around groceries, but he doesn't have a lot of, you know, like contact, and we don't go in there and all of that sort of stuff. And my attitude is when I saw all these people getting like arrested in all these different places, I was thinking, well, if we just let them carry on as they were, it makes no difference to my gran. She's in our house. No one's making any contact with her. So the rest of us can have our, you know, like you say, get our herd immunity, and most of us will probably get it without too much trouble. I know, you know, I don't want to kind of downplay those that have had serious symptoms, but it seems most people don't have serious symptoms, like you say, particularly outside of those brackets of very old and having other health conditions and what have you. So, and also, to be honest, it is a two-pronged thing, which you mentioned before, and I do agree with you. It's a double thing. It's one, they don't seem to have the science quite right, and even if you forget about what they have the right to do and all the rest of it and the impact, it doesn't even seem, even based on their own data and even what their own saying, it doesn't seem that their tactics make a lot of sense, as we discussed earlier. You know, like, you know, you can go here but you can't go there, and it doesn't, a lot of it doesn't seem to make logical sense, even if you forgot about rights and violations of things like that. But then you throw that into the packet as well, and you've got this terrible situation where, because of the authoritarianism of closing businesses down and not letting people work, even those that want to, because of that authoritarianism and that government action, we then have people basically borderline begging for more of the same in the form of all the payments that they're saying, right, well, you've got to pay me now. You've taken away my ability to earn a livelihood. So, you know, pay me. Otherwise, what am I doing? I'm on the streets.
And Matthew,
sorry.
And one thing you know, you mentioned these payments, and that's very, very true. The people begging for them, but the problem is the governments don't have any money. They're printing money out of thin air. And in my background as an economist, I am extremely concerned about the inflation, the price inflation that's going to come out of this. I mean, people don't realize. I track the money supply very, very closely, and I watch 13-week annualized money supply growth. Generally, it's been somewhere between 3 and 5% over the last 10 years. When Bernanke, quote unquote, saved the economy, it probably maybe hit 18%. The last time there was anything close was in 1982 when Paul Volcker was Federal Reserve Chairman. It went to 20%. Right now, in the last 9 weeks, we have gone from 8% money supply growth to 40.7% money supply growth. That means they've actually increased the number of money in the economy by 40.7% on an annualized basis. That's a stunning, stunning number. And then, that just means there's more money bidding for all the goods out there. So,
and then people are going to feel the pinch of that down the line when the inflation directly affects the value of their money. I mean, it's like they say, the government robs you twice. They rob you through taxation, and then they rob you through inflation by robbing the value of the money that you do have. So
and then I fear, again, it's all, you know, what you mentioned. It's kind of like a domino effect. The government screws up here, so they do this, so they're making these payments, which is kind of going to cause the inflation. And then what they do is they'll probably put on price controls, which will make things even worse. Then you'll have shortages and all that. I mean, I remember some of the price controls that occurred during the 70s and 80s when Jimmy Carter and Nixon put price controls, especially on gasoline, and you would have long lines of people waiting to get gasoline, and you know, that could come back on a serious basis, especially because with these lockdowns, you're having all kinds of bottlenecks with supply. So you got less supply, you know, more money out there. It's potential for a real mess is big.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. It's a bit of a mess out there. Um, so just to clarify, because obviously, as you say, I mean, I'm very much on the same page as you as to how this would have played out. You know, like with regards to how you say about how this would have played out in a private property society, where people will basically be allowed to make their own decisions
Right.
with that regard within their private property. And to be honest, the Nations of Sanity project would have a very similar ethos. I think the only sort of difference is we would extend that. As I'm not saying you wouldn't extend it to that, but we would extend it as part of this by saying, because obviously your society is built on private property, whereas the Nations of Sanity is built on like the non-aggression principle and self-ownership, which is kind of like extending it's kind of like yourself being a private property. So
Right.
so I would have the same attitude to you, but I would say that would also be true of people even outside of their private property with regards to their own body and their own self, and how, you know, like you say, for example, if we all wanted to meet down the beach, it's no one's private property, but
Right.
we're all free to do that because we're free to, you know, to freely associate with ourselves. If there's some other people somewhere that are isolating, we don't have the right to invade their space,
Right.
again,
Right.
even if they're not in private property. But, you know, so again, very similar to what you were saying.
Yeah,
Like,
we're very close.
yeah, the only thing I would do is extend it to a person, as you would with the private property thing, and probably we could jump
I
from
could
that.
tolerate you as king.
Say again, sorry.
I could tolerate you as king. That's a lot to come from me.
Well, the ironic thing is my system wouldn't allow a king, but I know what you're saying. I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, I mean, to be honest, when we spoke last time, there were a lot of commonalities, obviously, between, because they're both based on property rights, and obviously a society based on the non-aggression principle is obviously
Right.
going to respect private property. And I think the only sort of areas where we kind of, you know, debated and discussed was really about was my sort of ethos of saying that I always thought that we needed the non-aggression principles law, because I always feel that underwrites property rights. You know, as like property rights exist as an extension of your self-ownership. You own yourself, therefore you own your actions, therefore you own property that you create or voluntary trade for, you know, acquire through voluntary trade, and that's how we define rightful ownership in the free society that you know, that I paint a picture of with the Nations of Sanity. So so like I say, that would be very similar with the COVID thing. The only other thing I would mention, sorry, just before we move on from the COVID thing, which I think anyone listening to this would probably chastise me for not mentioning, because obviously I'm in England, and one of the things, we have a national health service over here, socialised healthcare, as you call it, and one of the big things that the government used as a pretense for why, you know, their lockdown was so critical and why they could circumvent, you know, the things that we're talking about, was basically saying that they need to do it to save the NHS. They're basically saying that the NHS will be overloaded if we didn't take measures to kind of like, you know, to slow down the spread so it didn't hit some peak numbers, so that the NHS was overloaded. I don't really buy that for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the reasons is as much as they may have been overworked with so-called COVID cases, they're also cancelled everything else to try and compensate for that. And I know a lot of people who work for the NHS that are actually put on furlough and sent home and not able to work, because the areas where they do work are just no longer open for business, because the NHS basically took this idea that, okay, well, we can only really deal with COVID, and unless you're actually dying, everything else was kind of getting cancelled. I mean, even like, you know, like cancer patients weren't getting treatments and stuff like that, and you know, and a lot of people were complaining again about how, in addition to like the economic things that we've already mentioned, you know, like, because a lot of people say, well, you know, some things are more important than economics, like people's health. Unfortunately, they don't realise that the government actions have also more directly affected people's health. I mean, obviously, you can say how it would with, you know, people going out of business, but also just from the point of view of how sick people aren't getting the care they need from the health systems that we have, because they're actually forcing hospitals to shut down those services because they're supposed to be making themselves available, you know, to handle this onslaught of, and I'm not saying that there's been, you know, because obviously there's areas where hospitals are very busy with it, but there does seem to be that kind of contradiction in what they're saying. And again, sorry, I was just saying that's another example of where what they're doing just turns out to be counterproductive, because it's just creating more problems than it solves.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, in episode 4, I'm plotting my episodes out of this week in economics with Robert Wenzel. In that podcast, I'm going to be discussing this very, very point, because what it is, it's really a central planning attitude that they're looking at it, and they're looking at a static economy. Well, we have these many beds, and therefore, if we get this rush of people, we have to flatten the curve. Well, in a free market, that doesn't happen. Businesses adjust to flows of people. They're very, very creative people up there. Off the top of my head, and I don't know anything about the hospital administration, I can think about a half a dozen ways that I would handle flow of people. And one thing we're experiencing here in the United States is a lot of people are dying at home from heart attacks and things like that, because they're afraid to go to the hospital and get exposed to COVID, whether COVID is something you should be legitimately concerned about or not. But I would solve that very quickly. Say, okay, look, we have this one hospital, this one area where if you have COVID, this is where you are. You're going to be isolated from everything else. And there's a non-COVID area of the hospital right here. Come on down. I mean, they think in a very, very static way. They don't think creatively. And if you let every entrepreneur that's in the hospital business, in the industry, although there's a lot of statists in it now because it's so controlled by the government, but if you would open that up, there would never even be a problem of not enough beds for people suffering from COVID, and they would never cut business away and say, don't come for your scans and your tests and everything else. They would welcome the business. That's what free market people do. So it's a central planning, static thing, which shows how central planning they don't get it. They look at the current situation, they think that's how it is, and they think like technocrats, like engineers. Okay, well, we have these many new people, so that means we're going to have to eliminate these people. Well, you change things so you can allow for both, and you service whoever's coming in. And central planning never thinks like that, and it's impossible for them to think like that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there was no consideration for small businesses with respect for, like, when they're deciding, because obviously the government's given themselves the authority to decide who can be open and who cannot be. And obviously, as I say, I work for a company that's deemed an essential business because we supply food to supermarkets and all of that. So I'm able to carry on working, but then some other business that isn't deemed essential by the government is made to stop. And okay, yeah, they're getting their government payments, which, as we've mentioned, has its own problems. But just from the business person's point of view, many of those people, they know that when the lockdown ends, their payments are going to stop. But their business isn't just going to recover like that. The way that they've been damaged by what the government's done, and the fact that those of us, the companies that have stayed open throughout this lockdown because they've been considered essential, the fact that they've been able to do it without really any incident of outbreaks of COVID or anything like that. Like where I work, we have lorry drivers from Spain, we have lorry drivers from all over the country coming to us every single day that we're in contact with to a degree. I mean, they've made very kind of token gesture precautions with regards to now the truck drivers put their keys in a plastic bag before they give them to us. I mean, they're still giving us the plastic bag just as they would be giving us the keys, and stuff like that. But my point is we've been able to carry on and without any incident, and we're a big company. We're in contact all over the thing, lorry drivers and all of that, handling to supermarkets. The same with the supermarkets, and we're not having pandemics of problems within those businesses. So it does suggest that a lot of these other businesses that weren't deemed essential actually could have carried on if the government allowed them, because the fact that we've been able to do it and we're not all dropping dead because of it or causing problems in any way where we're affecting others. So it doesn't seem, for example, the area where I work, right next to us, there's a place that was forced to close down. But they can work just as safely as we can. You know what I mean?
Right.
But they're not deemed essential. But it's essential to them. The government might not view it as essential because they're not supplying food or they're not supplying something but it's essential to them because it's their business. And even if they're getting some kind of substitute payment during the period that they're being forced to close, that's not going to compensate for the damage that's being done to their little businesses. And most small businesses don't run with the level of excess. In fact, most people don't live with the level of excess that we can just afford to soak up this kind of hit to our earnings. You know what I mean? This is the problem with central planners, or another problem with them, is they don't they don't have any idea what it's like for real people. Most of them have never worked. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like on any level, whether it's a high level or a low wage level.
Right.
And so they don't really understand what it's like for people. I'll just give you one, sorry, I know I'm gone on a bit, but I'll give you a little real life example with my brother who has a garage. He employs just one person. So it's a very small business. And he did eventually get his furlough money for his employer. But for about nearly 2 months, he was expected to close his business down, but still pay his employer, even though he's got nothing coming in. He was, and the government like, well, we will give you the money, but it's like, yeah, but you're not giving it to me now. He's expected to just have it in his reserves to be able to pay, you know, and it's just stuff like that is a good example of how out of touch they are with real people's struggles.
Well, you know, I in a similar story, there's a friend I know at a restaurant who's a maitre d' at a restaurant. And I know him, and I also know the owner of the restaurant. And so I ran into the maitre d' and I asked him how he was doing. He's saying he's doing okay. I asked him, I said, well, how's Chris doing? That's the owner. He says, oh, he's got 3 restaurants. What does he have to worry about? And it just struck me. He didn't realize, you know, what a problem it is for a restaurant owner, where he's going to have to deal with rents, to negotiate whether he has to pay him, how he's going to pay him, or other things that he has to keep going. And I later ran into the owner, and I said, so, you know, so how are things going? And he told me he had to borrow money from family and friends to stay alive, you know. So there's a lot of people who, if they're not really in business, they don't get it at all. So it's a terrible thing. And another problem, the anxiety in the country, the depression, the number of suicides in the United States is going up. We're seeing reports of people saying, you know, they've seen a year's worth of suicides in just the last month and things, hospital people and psychiatrists and things like that. So, I mean, I think in my own case, when I was a young kid out there running around every night, and then suddenly that whole world is shut down to me. I mean, I'm a pretty tough guy. I would probably deal with it, but that would be that would definitely be a shock to my system. And if you're fragile, that's not a pretty place to be. I would think it's pretty bad. So that's another thing. I mean, they're ruining people. And now they're talking about opening up schools, making kids wear masks the entire time they're in there, keeping social distance. They can't run on the schoolyard during breaks. I mean, this is sick. These people are sick. I really think so.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got a little boy who's 5 years old, and obviously the schools are closed down at the moment, but they are reopening soon but they have allowed us to choose. They said we don't have to send our kids back. And I'm like, okay, well, what's the circumstances in which you're opening? Is it going to be with all these restrictions, or is it just going to be opening properly? And they're like, oh, well, no, it's going to be with all these restrictions. And they're like, well, then he's not coming back. Because from my opinion, there's two objections I have. One is I don't want him indoctrinated into all of that nonsense.
Right.
He's been able to live a life without all of that, because he's still, you know, having contact with me, and we're cuddling, and we're not doing none of that. You know, he knows it's going on, and he knows other people will want him to keep away from and all that. But, you know, I don't want him to be indoctrinated into that kind of behavior any more than is necessary. But also the other point I made is, if they are taking the position that it's not safe to go back to school without these measures, then it's not really safe to go back to school, is what they're saying. You know what I mean? They can't say it's safe to go back to school, but you've got to wear a mask and you're not allowed, because it's like, well, then it's not, you know, it's either safe or it's not. And I know about the cutting risk and stuff, but the fact of the matter is I think personally, I'm happy for him to go back to school when the schools open, as you know, back to business as usual. But until that happens, he's not going. And if I have to homeschool him as a result, then so be it. But I'm not having him go through that, because it's just unnecessary, and it's just going to affect him in way emotionally. At that age as well, it's not good. It's not good for children to be, you know, that it's not good for them, and I don't want him kind of affected emotionally by that. So yeah, for me, it's a double kind of objection. It's one, it's the emotional thing.
Yeah, other parents you talk to, how are they reacting to it? Have you talked to many parents? Or
yeah, a lot of them have similar kind of. I have spoken to some that are still going to send their children back to school. I think some of them almost out of kind of desperation, because they're back at work and they don't know what to do with their kids otherwise, kind of thing. But for those of us that can actually, you know, compensate, we've got enough family support that when I'm at work and when his mum's at work, we can still got someone to look after him and what have you. So because we're not in that sort of situation, we're taking more of that attitude. But a lot of people have that kind of attitude where they're like, well, if it's not safe to do it without the social distancing, then it's not safe to go back. And I think a lot of parents are concerned, same as me, about the emotional effect of having this weird, you know, wearing masks. I mean, there's stuff about how they were talking about how, like, if children wet themselves, then the parent, like the teacher, or, you know, like if children's hurt themselves, the teachers won't touch them, or, you know what I mean? Like they're getting really silly about it. And I just think that's going to cause more harm than good. And I just think under those circumstances, he's better off not at school. You know, I mean, it's not ideal for him to not be at school, and not just missing out on education, but missing out on the development of socializing with children and stuff. You know, but, you know, that's something if I have to do outside of that with, you know, with other willing parents and that, then I'll have to do it that way. But yeah, I just think it's going to be counterproductive. And even though it's not ideal for him to miss the school, I think it's even worse for him to go back to school under those circumstances.
Yeah. What's your take on vaccines, and especially for your child and things like that? Do you object to them, or do you have any concerns? Or
well, my child was vaccinated from birth. He actually kind of had to be one of them because he had an infection. There was an infection at birth, so both him and the mum had to have an injection because of that. So I wasn't in a position to kind of object. And his mum was quite adamant that she wanted him to have his initial injections. But we both agreed that he's not having any more sort of from now on kind of thing. To be honest with you, I don't really know enough about vaccines, which I'm kind of ashamed to say, considering I have a child, that I haven't, you know, researched it much more thoroughly than that. But I do know some parents who don't vaccinate, who are very adamant about not, and I don't see any problem. I mean, basically, my opinion of it as an overall thing, from a societal point of view, is it should be down to the parents. I think there's enough of a kind of debate about the efficacy and safety that I think it should be the choice. If you're convinced that it's the best thing to do for your child, then you go ahead. And if you don't feel that way, I don't think the government should be forcing either way. And I know, obviously, most parents I know have vaccinated their children. The parents that I know that haven't are the minority. But I have to say, none of them have any health problems, and at least one of them's nearly 16 now, and I've known her all her life, you know. So I don't know enough about it to speak with authority, but I honestly, I am kind of wary about. I think it's one of those things that's not a black and white thing. I think some people that are like anti-vax and some people are pro-vax. I don't think either of their positions are entirely great, because I think there's a bit more ambiguity than that. I think some vaccines are more valid than others, and I think others may, you know, I don't know enough about like the autism thing and stuff like that. And like so, I can't pretend that I know enough about any of this. But my general feel of what I have looked into and what I have researched is that it's not a clear-cut black and white thing. And because it's not a clear-cut black and white thing, I think at the end of the day, you have to leave it to the parents to make the best decision that they can try to make.
Right. Yeah, I was talking to a friend who did a little bit of research on this, and he told me back in the day there were basically two vaccines, one for polio and one for smallpox. And now there's something like 70 vaccines out there. So if you really let it rip. But I'll tell you, I think the one group that in general, there's probably exceptions, but in general that you can't ask about vaccines is medical doctors, because they're just indoctrinated in what they learn in school. I had a meeting a few months back with a doctor who was a hotshot doctor in the major building here in San Francisco. He charges $600 an hour for a visit and all this kind of stuff, a real major league guy. So we're having dinner, and I say to him, I said, all right, say I had children of the age when they would require a measles vaccine. Would you recommend that, not based on societal, you know, the societal idea, you know, if you give my child the vaccine, you know, it's going to protect somebody out there who can't get the vaccine and all that. Just, is it good for my child or is it not? And I said, because I remember getting measles when I was a kid, and everybody around me got measles and nobody ever feared it. We just, you know, it was a week off from school. And He says, oh, no, you have to have it. I said, well, why? And he says, well, I says, how many people die? I don't remember any fear. And I know all my friends had it. He says, no, it's about 10% of the people die who get measles. And I said, 10%? And then he says, he says, I bullshit about some things, but I've studied this and I know the numbers. And that number seemed it couldn't possibly be that high. So I went back and I did some research on it, and it's like 0.001% or something that die from measles. I mean, this is a doctor who's saying, yes, you need it. And he's basing it, just on whatever the popular trends are and things like that. Yeah, they don't really study this stuff. So,
yeah, I mean, as I say, I don't know enough about vaccines to speak with authority, but one subject I have done quite a lot of research and know a fair bit about is cannabinoid medicines, cannabis, basically. And
right.
So even though I don't know much about vaccines, one thing I have become sadly familiar with is how clueless doctors are on certain areas, because that's a perfect subject where you will struggle to find a doctor that has a clue what he's talking about on the subject. And I mean, I've spoken to, because I researched it a fair bit a few years back, because I was looking into the claims that it treated cancer, which seemed very unbelievable, and I wanted to look into it more and stuff. And after researching it quite heavily, although the degree to which it treats cancer is still debatable, but the fact that it has the potential to treat cancer and has a cancer-killing effect and is a viable treatment is now beyond doubt, to the point that pharmaceutical companies are even trialing, of course, patented versions, but that are going down this route. So there's obviously something to it. And researching, because a lot of the claims about cannabis, medicinal cannabis, I don't know how much you know about it, but a lot from a kind of outside perspective, a lot of the claims seem quite fanciful. And obviously people do get hyperbolic with, it cures everything. But the fact of the matter is, it's not a cure of everything, but it does have a lot of genuine medical applications. But if you speak to most doctors about it, they are completely clueless. They don't know, I don't know if you know, but we have an endocannabinoid system, which is basically a part of our immune system that's one of the most ancient parts of the mammalian immune system, which is why cannabis is so widely useful for various ailments, because it connects to this part of our immune system that is so wide functioning and covers so many areas. If you ask a doctor about I've had conversations with doctors where I said, well, what do you know about the endocannabinoid system? And they have no idea what I'm talking about. And that's scary, because that's like speaking to a doctor and saying, what do you know about T cells? And them saying, I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? In fact, it's worse than that, because it's a more fundamental part of our physiology. So I mean, a bit of a tangent there, but that just to demonstrate I'm no stranger to how clueless certain parts of the medical establishment can be. And of course, there's a lot of corruption in there, because I mean, one of the things that sums it all up for me, and this about that, and also about how government are as well, is right now they done a trial on 3 compounds to do with cannabis: CBD, THC, which is the stuff that gets people high, and a chemotherapy drug. And they done like a study using like each 3 on a particular type of cancer, and they've done like each one on its own, then like different ones in combination. Anyway, cut a long story short, the THC was proved more effective than the CBD, but the THC and the CBD together proved more effective than either one alone. The FDA have just approved a patented CBD medicine for the treatment of this particular type of cancer. But it's like, well, hang on a minute. The studies say that THC is more effective than CBD, and THC and CBD together is more effective than CBD on its own. So why are they trialing the least effective cannabinoid? Simple. They can patent it. And that is a perfect example of both the ignorance of the medical establishment, but also the corruption with regards to the combination of the government regulation on medicines, the drug laws, obviously, with regards to cannabis, the patenting system, which is its own problem and causes its own problems with bringing up prices and not allowing the free market to bring down prices in the medical system, because you have all these patents and license. I mean, for example, I remember you remember that story of that guy who bought that pharmaceutical company, and I think it was an AIDS drug that he whacked up the price really high, like 2,000% or something, and people saying, oh, it's a disgrace and all the rest of it. And it, don't get me wrong, it was pretty contemptible. But my point was, yeah, but why is he allowed to do that? Because no one else is allowed to make a cheaper product, because he has this copyright on it. And things like that, I think people don't realize that things like that massively push up the cost of healthcare, because one, you're not getting the most effective medicines, but then even the medicines you are getting are artificially more expensive than they need to be, because you've got all this patents and licensing and regulations that just drive up the cost and create little monopolies. So
yeah, well, I'll tell you a similar story with regard to COVID treatment. I was on a panel seminar, virtual seminar, a few weeks back, and before we actually had the seminar, we had a pre-seminar a few days before to discuss what we were going to talk about. And I had casually mentioned, and this was a seminar that included economic type experts and also medical personnel. And I casually mentioned, I think ventilators are killing more people than helping them. And one of the doctors objected. He said, you can't say that. You don't have any studies that prove that. I said, well, there's reports out on him. And I told him about a Chinese doctor who conducted an autopsy and said how the lungs acted differently. And there was a doctor in the United States, the same thing, in that if you were actually putting these people on ventilators with the full blast of the ventilation rather than the oxygen, you were killing them because of what the COVID was doing to the lungs. That was different from normal treatments where you would use a ventilator. And he was just shocked and appalled at it. And so then I got a call after the pre-conference, and the organizer of the conference said, hey, Bob, do me a favor, don't bring that up about the ventilators killing people. So just yesterday, North Health and Northwell Hospital Organization in New York City, which includes all the top respected hospitals, is doing a study to determine if the ventilators kill people, because they say 80% of the people died who were put on them, and there are now indications that the lung therapy. But you would think that if on anything, doctors would be reading up and studying about what's coming, what kind of information is coming out on COVID and treatments, because you're going to see COVID patients. Yet none of the people on the panel, none of the doctors had ever heard about the autopsy in China and the other studies I mentioned. They were clueless, and they were shocked that an economist is going to bring this up, and and now we're getting the studies. I mean, there'll be a lot. And just another quick story, because this might be helpful for your patients. I don't know how easy it is to do this with the health system in England, but my advice is, if you get some information from a doctor and he doesn't help you, and you don't think the information is right, I mean, seek out someone else. I was in Manhattan, this was say 10 years back, and I had an earache, and it was just a terrible, terrible earache. And I went to a emergency room doctor, and he looked in there, young guy, he looks and he goes, you don't have an infection. There's nothing wrong with your ear. I says, I have pain. I tolerate pain, and I don't imagine pain. I have pain. He says, no, there's nothing wrong with you. And he dismissed me. So a couple of days later, I just happened to be walking by the Manhattan Eye, Ear, and Nose Institute. And it was at a time when they were seeing walk-in patients. So I went in, and the doctor analyzed me, and I forgot, he might have taken some kind of test or something. But then he calls me back in his office. He says, okay, what you have is a blocked saliva gland. And there's two things we can do here. We can either shoot dye in so we see exactly where it is and how to remove it, or you can suck on a hard candy and it'll go away. He says, the therapy's up to you. I said, I think I'm going to go with the hard candy therapy. And the point is, though, I mean, the right guys, get it right away. They know what it is. And, you get somebody that is a generalist or is not familiar with something, they can be way, way off. So whether it's doctors, lawyers, whatever the thing is, keep on going until you find the right guy.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the problem is, I think there's a little bit of a epidemic of arrogance amongst a lot of doctors. I don't want
Right,
to tar them all with the same brush, of course, but there does
right,
seem to be. I mean, not like I say, I had very similar arrogance whenever I tried to speak to any doctors about cannabis medicines, and then like I remember a few years later visiting the doctor's office, and he had a little leaflet, like an official leaflet about cannabis medicines because they're obviously starting to introduce them. And it's
right,
like all of a
right,
sudden he's got this leaflet where he's being made to educate himself on stuff that he knew nothing
right,
about 2 years ago, but was
right,
dismissing as, oh, that's hippie nonsense or whatever. Unfortunately, they're in their little thingies, which is fine.
right,
I don't expect all doctors to know everything, but unfortunately, too many of them practice an arrogance where they act like they do know everything, even when they
right,
obviously clearly don't. And
right.
I mean, I'm sure we could trade stories all night, but I'll just give you one more, which is a bit of a chilling example of how incompetent they can be. Was my uncle had severe back pain for months and months and was just told he had sciatica. That's constantly, you just got sciatica, go to therapy, you got sciatica,
Yeah,
you got
yeah,
all of this. Turned out eventually he got a second opinion after collapsing and going to hospital, got a second
really,
opinion. Turned out he had bone cancer. And whether or
really,
not he would have been saved with an earlier diagnosis, I'm not going to say that would happen because
right,
obviously it was still quite advanced and sadly he did pass away. But there was an example of him for months just being said, no, you got sciatica, and again, it's the dismissiveness. We're all human, we all make mistakes, but
right,
it's just that air of arrogance that leads to a lot of the with a lot of these doctors, because they're not even prepared to accept the fact that maybe they didn't look at that properly, or maybe there's something they're not aware of, or maybe there's, you know what I mean? And I think
right.
there's just I think there's a little bit too much of that in the medical establishment, and
Mhm.
sadly, and you like say you've experienced the same thing where you try to say something to a doctor, he's almost offended that you would dare,
Yeah,
and then the
right,
next week you'll be vindicated because
right,
unfortunately,
right,
until it comes down officially to him, until it's come down from
right,
above, it's not
right.
true in their world.
Yeah, yeah,
Like I say, like that doctor, until he had a little leaflet from his superiors saying, okay, now you're going to be prescribing certain cannabis medicines, so you need to learn about what it does.
yeah.
Until that,
Well,
it was nothing. It was hippie nonsense, and you're talking nonsense, and you know.
yeah. Well, I'll tell you what's funny is I'm now emailing that whole group. I have the email list of everybody that appeared on it summer. So I sent them a link, sort of with a little bit of a stinger in there. I said, well, I'm glad to see the top hospital in New York is doing heroic things here and wants to find the truth. Is really trying to see what's really going on with ventilators rather than just dismissing that these people were going to die anyways. So I'm
Yeah, I
sending a
had
couple of.
Yeah, I had heard the 80% thing actually before. I mean, I hadn't looked
Yeah,
into this that much, but I had heard that myself about where they were saying that I think they had like an 80% death rate on ventilators,
yeah,
and it raised a
and
lot of questions about, well, hang on a minute, are we actually causing these with the ventilator?
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
some people could say, oh, well, if they're going on ventilators, it's because they're already, I mean, there's two
right,
ways of looking
right,
at it, so it's not
right.
conclusive on its own, but it
Yeah, yeah,
certainly warrants investigation, and
right.
that's what they need to do. They need to have the attitude of being a little bit more open-minded to the
Yeah, and
possibilities.
here's the thing, which comes back to the government in medical treatment and all that. Now, the Chinese doctor that did the autopsy and he explained what he saw was in early March, and still in late March and April, President Trump and Anthony Fauci were promoting how many ventilators they were getting out in the country, and then by that time, there are also other doctors that were saying, this looks different. They're not responding the same way that other people we put on ventilators do. There's something else going on here. Now, it didn't seem they were even aware of the autopsy that I was aware of, but at least they, from their actual experience with patients, they were realizing something was going on. And you would think Fauci, who's supposed to be on top of all, I think the guy's a psychopath, uh, would have been on top of this stuff, but they weren't. And they were just promoting how many ventilators they were sending out. And to me, it's like they're saying how many people they're going to kill today. I mean, it's really, really insane how many more people they're going to kill. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
I mean, the COVID thing's been a very difficult one to kind of assess for me because there's been so much kind of information out there. And even the information, I mean, I don't listen just to the government because I know what liars they are most of the
Right.
time. But even if you just listen to the government, it's still not consistent. They even contradict themselves a lot of the time. You know what I mean? From one week to the next, and you're thinking. So it's like it's not just people like me who would want to research different sources and might not know what's true because you're hearing conflicting stories. Even your kind of stereotypical sheep who just listens to everything the government says and believes it's all gospel. Even they're going to be confused because they're being told things that conflict with each other and contradict. And one minute they're being told that they can do this, next minute they're being told that they can do that. One minute they're told to wear masks, then they're told it does no good. Some people say it's actually a health hazard because if you're wearing masks all the time, you're building up carbon dioxide and you're not getting proper air in. And I mean, there was an incident, again, police being overly heavily-handed to say the least, but there was an incident where a woman was assaulted by police, arresting her because she wasn't wearing a mask properly, but she was saying, I'm asthmatic and it's causing my asthma because I need to get a proper, proper flow of air. And I mean, she ended up getting arrested in front of her child, which is all kinds of traumatic for the child. I mean, it's the government overstepping and mucking things up and violating our rights and all these things is bad enough on a normal day, but everything's gone into overdrive since this COVID thing, both with regards to the violation of rights, but also with regards to the idiocy of half of what they're doing. Even if you forgot about the rights, even if you were the sort of person that says, I'll accept anything the government does for my own good, even if you were one of those sort of people, it still wouldn't make sense what they're doing. You know what I mean? It still seems counterintuitive, even according to their own narrative.
Yeah, it's really, it's bad, and I wonder where this is going. I mean, is it all going to unwind, or are they going to make? I mean, they're talking about the contact tracing now on the apps, which. I have a video up at my site, Target Liberty, and there's a woman there who took the courses to be certified as a contact tracer. So what that means is if you've come in contact with someone that has the virus, you're going to have to self-quarantine for 14 days. And there's various ways they're now attempting to track you. And what that means is it's very possible you could quarantine yourself for 14 days, be perfectly healthy, and then if you go out and are on a subway and your contact trace app tells you there's somebody else there that they learn the next day has the virus, you can be quarantined for another 14 days, and it could just go on and on. And then the contact tracer, they're training the contact tracers to call these people at random times that will be quarantined and say, okay, put your phone on video and show us that you're in your house. I mean, it's crazy. It's really crazy.
It's Big Brother stuff, isn't it? I mean, I mean, I hear a lot of conspiracy theories. Obviously, everything has conspiracy theories attached to it. There's not an event that happens that doesn't have loads of conspiracy theories about it. But one of the things that struck me about this, obviously, it's obviously caused a lot of theories to go wild. But one of the things that is undeniable, whether you take it, I don't pay, because it's all conjecture, so there's no point taking it very seriously unless you know any hard facts. But one of the things I do find quite compelling is the government are almost acting out the authoritarian playbook of 1984. You know what I mean? They're almost proving the conspiracy theorists right with their actions. Like they're saying, this is all conspiracy theory just to get us vaccinated and chipped and thingied. And you're like, oh, well, that sounds crazy. And then the government comes out and says, right, well, people are going to have to be vaccinated and we're going to have contact traces. And they start saying all this. And then you suddenly think to yourself, regardless of, what you think about the COVID thing, you're just sort of thinking, well, it all sounds like we're going towards some kind of 1984 style society. And
whether it's being done by accident or by happenstance or whether it's plotted out, but some of these things they do, like Fauci early on when there wasn't enough scientific evidence at all, said that the COVID-19 was 10 times more deadly than the common flu. Now that there was no science, I wrote a piece at that time saying there was absolutely no science to back this up. There's just nothing there. And, you just wonder where he gets this from. I mean, if he's a scientist, he's either lying, but, you don't, or is he that mistaken? I mean, I saw the problems with the Ferguson paper 48 hours after it was written. I read the paper and I said, look, this is wrong. This is not, he can't reach these conclusions. Now, if I can reach that, and I have some training in statistics, but I'm not a medical scientist. The stuff just looked obvious to me was
Well,
incorrect.
there are a lot of medical scientists that are saying this, though. So you may not be, but there are plenty that are also saying
Right.
it. Because a lot of people that look at someone like Fauci say, "Oh, well, he's a medical authority. You've got to listen to him."
Right.
It's like, well, yeah, but there's plenty of scientists that. Yeah, I mean, I used to make the same case when I was talking about like the cannabis thing and that. Because people say, "Well, why do you know more than a doctor?" And it's like, yeah, I can point to other doctors and scientists who do know about this, who are qualified. Because no one's going to listen to me unqualified. Fair enough.
Right.
But there are actual scientists who've done the studies. There are actual doctors that know about this that are saying it, and don't take my word for it. Take theirs. And I mean, sometimes I would love to have like some kind of if you did it as like a television show or whatever, but like some kind of like truth finding debate where someone like that Fauci was stood up, and then you had another doctor on the other side with all his and almost present it like a court case where like, okay, well, let's get to the truth then, and then see who's lying or see who's wrong. It doesn't have to be lying, it can be it can be mistaken or whatever, but let's if we all just I sometimes feel like I just want us to have an objective pursuance of truth to find out. You know what I mean? And bring it to the bear. It's like on everything. It's like things that I don't know much about, like the climate debate. And you have like, you say these scientists that say this and scientists that say that. Okay, well, let's get them in a not an actual courtroom, but a courtroom style scenario where they have their evidence, they make their cases, they can dispute what others have said, and we can have independent fact checkers, and let's get to the bottom of some of this stuff. Let's get to the actual truth, because that's what a lot of this depends on.
I'll tell you, here's the one problem with that. You're probably familiar with Newt Witkowski, the scientist who says all these lockdowns and all this are make no sense, and he's a renowned epidemiologist. I always have a problem with that word. He's been very, very outspoken in saying, we should just allow the herd immunity to go through the society. People who are at risk should self-isolate, and that's it, and be over in 4 weeks. There's a debate society in New York City called the Soho Forum, and they asked him if he would be willing to debate and present his case, and he said yes, but they can't get anybody to debate against him. That's the problem. These people who, the left,
it all, doesn't it?
Yeah. The people on the left really, they don't mind lying. They really, really don't. They're really more concerned with gaining power. And once you realize that, you can realize that what they're saying does not, if they think it's going to advance their, by any means necessary to them, means if lying works to get our goals, that's what we'll do. And it's shocking how often, especially here in the San Francisco area, you come across that a lot. I remember once I was at some network thing, and there was a woman next to me, and we ended up talking about Paul Krugman. I says, he lies a lot about what he says, and then he doesn't know some of the things. And she says, well, if he lies, that doesn't bother me, but if he doesn't know something, that's different. So it's part of their
that's almost backwards, strategy. Isn't it?
It's part of their strategy. They really it comes as a shock when you first hear something like that, but then you realize, this is if it will advance their goal, they have no problem with lying. And that's why they're really afraid to debate people who stick to truth and reality, because they can't deal with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as unique to the left, because I see similar on the right, bad actors and what have you. So I wouldn't necessarily label it as a left phenomenon, but I would agree with you other than that. I do see a lot of like you say, bad actors, bad faith, no honesty. I mean, I think it's very telling that none of them are willing to kind of, to come out and have these debates and what have you. But I do think that that's what's kind of needed, as difficult as it would be to get in place, because I think people are starved of correct information.
I think you would be a great host or judge for the show. I highly recommend you pursue the idea.
Thank you. I'll see. I'll look into it, see what I can do.
You know, there was a TV show called McLaughlin Group. It's still on McLaughlin Report and McLaughlin Group maybe. And the founder passed away, I guess, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. But when he first got the idea for the show, I didn't realize this at the time when the show came out. But he had to push and push for like 10 years before he would get any funding or anything for the show, and it's been a major success. So you know, that kind of stuff can happen. I think it's a great idea you have.
Okay, well maybe I'll use that encouragement to look into that more then, perhaps. Funnily enough, actually, might be a good opening just to speak briefly about the whole left and right thing, because an idea I wouldn't mind sort of running past you and getting your thoughts on is, it might seem an ambitious project, but part of my Nations of Sanity project is obviously, you know, trying to, obviously I've got the very specific idea of wanting to establish the non-aggression principles of the law, and the reasons why I think that would be a game-changing benefit to society. But as a more general thing, I want to try and bring people into the subject of understanding the concept of self-ownership, property rights, and the non-aggression principle. Right. And I look at how I can kind of bring people in there. And if I look at people on the sort of right wing, and I don't mean extreme right, I mean conservatives, you know, normal people, and I can see quite clearly their path to voluntarism, because they already, most of them to a certain degree, understand and respect property rights, understand things like you know, voluntary trade and basic sort of principles like that. So that's my kind of door to get people from the right wing to, and it's just about saying, look, you already kind of accept these principles. You just need to understand that these same principles need to be expanded to other things that you perhaps don't expand them to. Like, for example, traditionally, people on the right wing have often been supportive of drug laws. They need to get rid of that. They need to stop supporting that, because it contradicts the freedom that they invoke when they're complaining about the economic freedom that they want. It's like, you can't complain that you haven't got the freedom to earn money without it being taxed, but you want to deny someone the freedom to choose what they put in their own body. You know, the two don't mix and match.
Right.
But equally, I thought, well, I can kind of mirror that approach for the left wing. And I've really been exploring, and I know it might sound almost comically ambitious, but I've kind of been exploring what I'm calling the left wing road to voluntarism, and how I can kind of speak to people on the left wing and appeal to their values where it does touch with freedom. You know, there's that, I don't know if you're familiar with that old kind of, it's a bit of a lazy description of libertarianism, but libertarianism was often described as socially left and economically right.
Right.
And basically what they mean by that is their appeal to freedom gives them more in common with the left wing when it comes to social issues like drug laws, right, or opposing aggressive wars and military spending and stuff like that. But then the left wing go completely totalitarian and authoritarian and government loving when it comes to the economic side of things. And then then you have the opposite with the right wing, where they're all into freedom and liberty when it comes to the economy, but then they want to enforce harsh social laws, whether it's drug laws or prostitution laws or whatever things that they want to kind of enforce. And often they tend to be the more supportive of the military as well, particularly with regards to kind of aggressive wars. So
yeah, I got to just quickly, the left here in the United States, I don't know how much it is in the UK, but the left here seems to be a lot more pro-military than they used to be in the old days. But go ahead, I'm getting your point.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think that's a relatively recent phenomenon with the left in the US, although I do understand there are differences between the left and right in the US and the UK. But anyway, but just going back to that, I've been really thinking about, because one of the, there's a great misunderstanding with voluntarism, because most voluntarists are anarcho-capitalists and free market anarchists, and people that approach it, and which makes sense, because if you're going to look at a voluntary society, then what economy seems to fit that better than voluntary trade? You know, that seems almost a no-brainer. But when I speak to people on the left wing, I say, well, you know, who talk to me about their need, you know, who are very anti-capitalist, but you know, obviously a lot of that, you know, they need to kind of lose, but some of it they can retain. Some of the stuff where they're saying, well, you know, we want, for example, we want social safety nets and we want nationalised health system. Like for example, in the NHS, most people in England, even on the left and right, funnily enough, and this will be a difference between left and right, but you'll even find right-wingers in England who will be supportive of socialised healthcare because we have an NHS and it's something that people in England want. My point when I've been speaking to a lot of left-wingers is like, well, there's actually no reason why you can't have these things on a voluntary basis, because as long as you're not forcing people that don't want to be a part of it to be a part of it, you can have that. And this is one of the great misconceptions that I'm trying to overcome with voluntarism. Yes, most voluntarists are anarcho-capitalists, but they don't have to be. They don't all have to be. Like, all anarcho-capitalists are voluntarists, but not all voluntarists have to be anarcho-capitalists. A voluntarist can pursue any way of life, and whether they work or not is beside the point. The fact of the matter is, left-wingers can pursue any kind of collectivism as long as it is a voluntary form of collectivism that doesn't involve coercion and the violation of rights. So in theory, whether it would work in practice is another conversation, but in theory, in a free society, you could have communes, you could have people living voluntary socialism, and you could have it as an outright thing or as a hybrid with trade or whatever. And then you could have other people that are completely free market. They can all peacefully coexist as long as they're respecting each other's rights. And one of the things that I want to try and really emphasize, and this is where I think I'm going to, because I'm not going to necessarily win over the left with that. I mean, I think they're all valid arguments, but that's not necessarily going to sweep them off their feet. But one of the things that I think that may actually resonate with them is to point out that many of the programs they support, I think even they would recognize that they don't function properly. They're full of corruption, they're full of bureaucracy, and a lot of that is almost inevitable as a result of ruling governments. So what I'm trying to get them to understand is that a lot of the systems that a lot of the kind of programs that they would want to support and be involved in would actually function much better in a non-coercive system. Because, and the NHS is a perfect example of this, if you had the NHS over here in England, say for example, all of a sudden became a voluntary thing. So people that no longer want to be part of the NHS can drop out, which means they're no longer obliged to contribute to it, but it might also mean that they're no longer entitled to receive the benefits for it. And then the NHS would almost, I suppose in a way, it almost would function like a private club. If you want to explain it in a way that a capitalist will understand and accept, and many of them would say, oh, well, it's still free market then. If it's voluntary trade and it's, free association, then it's still free market. But from a left-winger's point of view, if it's not capitalism in their mind, because it's still it's not profit it's not competition profit business models. It's more like communal collectivism, like forms of socialism and all the rest of it. But the thing that really makes socialism evil is the state violence that's used to force people into it. If you had voluntary forms of that, like I say, they might not work. But the fact of the matter is if they don't work, the only people that are paying the price are the people that have volunteered to be a part of it. And no one else is being forced to prop it up. You know what I'm saying? And then you can say to those people, and just like you can't force the right wingers to pay for your healthcare, they can't force you to pay for the military spending that they want to contribute to, or whatever thing, because this is the thing with the left and the right. They both support taxation. They just want it for different things. And my point is, well, if you both want it for different things, let's get rid of taxation and the force and coercion that's associated with that, and create voluntary systems where you contribute to the things you want. You don't contribute to the things that you don't want. And if that means that you're not allowed to receive the benefits of them, then that's fair enough. That's part of a voluntary interaction. But I just think, it's something I'm working on, and it might be an overly ambitious goal, but I'm trying to find, because I do really think that voluntarism, at least in theory, I know it's much different when you get into the real world in practice, but at least in theory, voluntarism represents a common ground for left and right-wing people. For people that have got left-wing ideals and people that right-wing ideals, I think they can both peacefully coexist in a voluntary society much better than they do in a statist society. Because the problem is, the left-wing and the right-wing have good reason to hate each other under a statist society, because whichever one's in power is going to in some way impose on the other. Some way going to violate the other, some way are going to rob the other. So that's why they hate each other. But if you had a system where it's like, okay, well, we can work together if there's ways in which we can, but if we're so far apart on certain things, then we disassociate on those things. And if we remove that power to force people into things, then things will survive on their own merit. And then if these programs that the left wingers pursue turn out to be just no good because they don't work, forgetting about the coercion, even on a free society they don't work, then they'll fail, but they'll fail due to merit, not due to corruption, not due to bureaucracy, which is, no matter how you feel about socialism, the biggest evil about them and the biggest problem with them from an efficiency point of view comes from the coercion associated with the governments that run them. What do you think about that?
No, I think if you can promote that and get some ears listening to it, that would be great. But I just don't know about, most people just have this mentality that the way they see things is the way it should be, and everybody should be forced to do that. That's the tough nut to crack.
I agree, and it's going to be easier said than done. I mean, I'm not pretending it's going to be simple because I realize. And then
aside, socialized healthcare, whether it's voluntary or not, it's not going to work. I mean, if someone wants to, spend their time flapping their arms until they start to fly, I have no problem with that. But I'm not betting on that actually working. So,
well, perhaps not. But like I say, at least under that system, it can fail or succeed under its own merits. It's not being propped up by stolen money of taxation and what have you.
Right.
So that would be my appeal to it. I mean, I do see ways. It might not necessarily be, but the thing is, because a lot of the problems that people point to with regards to the American health system, they will point to capitalism as the reason. They'll say, "Oh, it's everything's so expensive because of the greed and the profit motive of capitalism." But what they don't realise is it's the government restrictions, the government regulations, the government copyright that drives up the prices, prevents the competition that would bring the prices down. So it might well be that in a free society, even the left-wingers will realise that their healthcare is going to get to them better through a free market system. But in a free society, even a socialized system would work better than it currently does in a coercive system, because all of a sudden, again, you're losing all those things that cost the money. Like a perfect example in the NHS is, and I'm sorry to keep talking about cannabis, but it's something obviously know a fair bit about, but a perfect example of that is the UK government licensed a company called GW Pharmaceuticals to grow cannabis in this country for medical use. And they produce a product called Sativex, which is a patented under the tongue spray. It's just cannabis diluted in a alcohol solution, but it's like a patented product. They've managed to patent it somehow. And they've just also very recently released another product called Epidiolex, which is like the Sativex is THC and CBD, so it's literally just cannabis. And the Epidiolex is just CBD, and that's for treating epilepsy. Anyway, cut a long story short, both of the Sativex was approved long ago for medicinal use in England. But because GW Pharmaceuticals are the only company that's allowed to produce it, and no one else is even allowed to make cannabis officially or unofficially, it's illegal for normal people to grow, what have you. So they've literally got that monopoly on it. But most NHS providers will, because we have like we have like an NHS for the country, but then we have these local providers that approve treatment, for local areas. They're called NICE, ironically, because they're not nice. But they won't approve this cannabis spray for most patients in most areas for one reason and one reason alone: it's too expensive. Now, the reason it's too expensive is because they're the only company that are allowed to make it. I mean, there was even a group in Spain who proved how much they were ripping, because I can't remember how much it is, but it's like £300 or £400 pounds a bottle. And this group called Bud Buddies, who are like a compassion group in Spain who provide patients with medical cannabis, they produced a spray, under the tongue spray, that was identical, had an identical cannabinoid profile. It was literally identical in every way, and they made it for $10. And they said, that's how much this really costs. And we're not even a big company. We're just like a few people with pots and pans, and you know what I mean? So if we can make it for a cost of $10, why does it cost this giant company that's mass producing it on a grand scale? Why is it £300? And why can't patients get it? Now, in both cases, that's the government getting in the way. And if you got rid of that, whether you had a socialized healthcare system or whether you had a free market system, that problem would be solved in both systems. Now, don't get me wrong. I know, especially as a free market person like yourself, you're still going to say, well, I'm still not interested in the socialism. Even in your voluntary world, I'll still take my free. And that's fine. And that probably would be the more, But my point is so many, but the reason why I bring this up is because this is how you speak to the left-wingers, because this is stuff that they do believe in and do care about. And you can point to them and show them where where it's even counterproductive for what they want. Now, maybe in a free society, you could even educate them further and show them a little bit how the market can actually provide more, it's not the evil that they portray it to be. But the fact of the matter is if you get the government out of the way, whether it's some kind of collectivized program or whether it's just pure individual free market competition, either way, so many of the problems are going to be resolved just by removing that giant apparatus that's driving the cost up, and all of that. So yeah, that was just my, I mean, like I said, I understand it's very ambitious because particularly now the left have become more authoritarian. I mean, I remember a time, I'm not that old, and I remember a time when the left were more associated with freedom. Well, whether it was justified or not, it was always the right-wingers that were considered pro-government authoritarianism, and the left-wingers were the hippies saying, no, we all got to be free, man, and, and all that kind of stuff. And somehow or another, that's almost flipped. I wouldn't say it's completely flipped because, there are still some people on the left who have some kind of sense of rights and liberty, and there are still plenty of people on the right who don't have a sense of that. But I've just noticed that so many of them are kind of moving away from that. So it's probably going to be a more difficult task now than it was, say, with the left-wingers of the 60s or 70s. But I still think it's at least theoretically achievable. And one thing I will say on this as well, as difficult it is and as pig-headed as people can be, the thing that makes it at least theoretical possible is you can point to a principle that they do hold, just like I do with the right wingers. Like I can point to a principle of liberty. Like for example, if I speak to a left winger who will no doubtably oppose drug laws, and I will be able to agree with them. I say, yeah, drug laws are wrong, but let's examine why they're wrong. They're wrong because you own yourself, and no one else has right to you. And because you own yourself, then you should be able to take drugs. But if you own yourself, then you should also be able to choose where you spend your money and what you do with your labor. You know what I mean? So what I'm saying is, you can attach one principle they do believe, and it's not a guarantee. They can be pig-headed, they can deny it, but if you can show them that there's that principle is actually a commonality to many of the things that they think that they oppose or they do oppose or whatever, like their potential commonalities with somebody on the right wing. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like you can show the principle.
I just think, we're so far away from reaching either the left or the right. I mean, they're just, their mentality is so far up. In science, the structure of scientific revolutions by Thomas Kuhn talks about how paradigm shifts work in science and in how theories change and advance and all that. And he talks about it's very, very hard to change the old crowd that has the old view, and to break into a new paradigm is just difficult and takes very, very unique circumstances. And I think that applies generally to the political views and stuff like that. I mean, it's just we're just in a very, very strange state right now where people don't seem to believe that much in freedom. For example, what do you make of this attempts to shut down free speech? From people giving speeches or banning them on YouTube and things like that. I mean, that's
another thing that self-ownership takes care of. I mean, this isn't.
I agree. Yeah. But why are people supporting this? Why? I mean, I think it's a small group that's really aggressively pushing it, but it seems like most of the left sort of agrees with it. It's like, okay, we got to ban this because it's terrible or whatever. Trump said it, so we got to ban it, whatever the case might be. I think in the old days, the left was really for free speech, and your real classical liberals, which would be on the right, were always for that. And now on the left, you get so many that are either against free speech or really don't have a problem with it. I mean, it's shocking.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I said about how the left have become more authoritarian, it was the free speech area that I was kind of thinking of the most, because that's where I've seen the biggest shift. Because as you say, you go back to the 70s and 80s, you want to talk about free speech, you probably have pretty good conversations with left wingers. Whereas
Right.
now, like you say, many of them, I mean, from what I have listened to, and obviously I don't agree with them, but from what I have listened to try to steelman their position, they seem to take the position of like things like fascism and like they basically say, look, certain speech is so dangerous. That's their kind of position. I think they think
Right.
certain speech is so dangerous. Now, obviously, I disagree with them on it, but if I was to have a conversation with one of them about it, I think what I would probably want to say is, because again, you get them to the principle where you've got that commonality. So what they say, oh, this speech is dangerous because it could lead to fascism, and I'm like, okay, what's so bad about fascism, you know? And then they'll say, oh, well, it's this totalitarian government that violates rights and freedom, blah blah blah, and I'm like, exactly. So
Right.
we don't
That's
want
good.
you know what I mean? It's like you're kind of
Yeah.
showing them that they,
Right.
it's trying to, like I say, it's not a guarantee, but it's trying to showing them that something they do believe should actually make them also believe this. They should
Right.
support free speech because they oppose fascism. And
Right.
even though their fear is that, oh, if we let the fascists speak, they might bring in fascism. It's like, yeah, but if you can't fight fascism with fascism. If you really want to oppose fascism, you've got to let them speak. You've got to let freedom express itself, because then they've got nowhere to go. But the problem is by being, I mean, it's Antifa, a perfect example. Antifa, they call themselves anti-fascist, but they act like fascists most of the time. You know what I mean? So it's just about, if you can kind of, I'm not saying just showing them that contradictions and going to open them all up, open all their eyes and wake them up. It might open some people's eyes and other people are going to carry on being blind. But I think if there is any hope, and I understand your skepticism because it does seem, you know, but if there is any hope, that's where it is. You know, if there is hope of bringing people together, then this is where it is. That's why I say about, like, with this whole non-aggression principle thing, I understand it's pie in the sky. I don't, you know, if someone said to me, how much are you going to bet that your nation's of sanity is going to have its revolution in the next 10 years? I'm not betting anything on that, because it's probably never going to happen. But if there's any way for a free society to happen, our common that would bring people together, it would be the non-aggression principle, if there's any way of doing it.
Yeah. I don't consider the non-aggression principle pie in the sky, or the idea of promoting it pie in the sky, in the sense that it will never happen. But I consider it where people like you and me are at with the 1%ers as far as the idea of freedom, right? I mean, most people just don't get it at all. And then so you have to bring in the Hayek idea of secondhand dealers, and how ideas really develop and go out through the world. And we're just really at very, very early stages, because, you know, we get it, but if we try and say the things we're saying now to almost anybody out there, you know, they're just not going to pay any attention to us.
Yeah, I mean,
and you can't logic them out of it. I mean, most people, the concepts have to be very, very presented to them, very, very simple. They're gonna, if you do the whole logic thing with them, it's not gonna work. I don't really think so. So I see us, we're at the stage of the 1%ers where we really understand this stuff and are really still developing the ideas a bit, but also refining how we present it. So then there's probably the next group is the people who aren't really as much really thinkers completely the way we are, where we're studying all kinds of stuff, but they get what we're saying, but they may be better communicators / artists that can reach the people. Because I sometimes I'll come across a person and I listen to them and I think, I have no idea how to reach this person. It's not going to happen. And so then my thought goes, you know, it's got to go down the road where somewhere along the line, it gets to a person who knows how to talk to that person in whatever basic way, whatever world they live in, and what to say to them to get them the idea that freedom is a good thing. So what we're doing is very, very important. Now, maybe one of us is talented enough to, you know, take on 2 or 3 steps and not only really think this stuff out and be in the 1%er category, but also be the great communicator and artist influence a lot of people? Maybe, but that's a lot of work to do.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think anyone can do it all, and I think you would. I mean, just to clarify, what my pie in the sky comment was referring to making the non-aggression principle the universal law for society, being pie in the sky. You know, so that's the pie in the sky. But yeah, no, I mean, talking to people like yourself. Well, that's preaching to the choir, but like, you know, talking to people. I mean, I find, funnily enough, talking to people on a one-to-one basis. I know that's not very good for changing the world, because that would take me a while if I'm just doing it on a one-to-one basis. But I find that talking to people on a one-to-one basis, I have a lot of success with this. You know, like, you know, and I talk to. I mean, one of the reasons why I even venture the idea of trying to convert leftists is because I have already on a one-to-one basis. Like, I've gotten a lot of support from people who were previously out full-blown socialists, because I was able to appeal to that. Because the thing is, because one thing that's always worth remembering is, you know, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, people don't think that they're evil and bad. And when they're promoting a system that's got evil and bad things about it, they don't focus on that. A socialist doesn't focus on the fact that he's robbing you. A socialist focuses on the fact that he's, you know, that it's providing welfare and it's helping people. You know what I mean? They're focusing on the positive side. So there's always a kind of foot in the door I've got, because there is a virtue that I can kind of say, okay, well, here's your virtue, here's your principle, here's your morality that you are using that supports this. Let me show you how just applying that same principle, not changing your views, but just applying that principle consistently, might make you rethink your views. I don't even present it as them changing their views. I just present it them as, are you sure you really think that? Because if you think this, then maybe you don't think that. And as I say, I've had a lot of success with people who previously identified as just outright socialists, and now they've either gone away from socialism completely and they're like anarcho-capitalists, or some of them are still got the socialist dream, but they're pursuing it under the voluntarist banner. You know, like they agree with me that even though they're still committed to these ideals, they agree with me that they don't have the right to force them on unwilling people. You know what I mean? So, and that's that's the only agreement you really need from people. You don't have to convert the capitalist to socialist and the socialist to capitalist. You just have to convert both to voluntarists, and then let the society express.
No, I get, and what you're saying really works. I mean, that's to the degree we're doing anything. It's, you know, converting a person here and converting a person there. But I think the eventual situation has to be sort of like the COVID-19 virus. You know, what is the R naught? You know, when you infect somebody, you know, and when you're infected and you infect 3 or 4 people, and it goes out in virus, and it goes out in that way, and, you know, you get the whole country basically infected within 4 weeks. I mean, there's some optimism there. But we're still at the stage where that are not. I mean, maybe we convince people, but then they come back to us because we have to talk to them some more and explain how it works and this and that. What we really need is there's got to be like simple, there's kind of like a social, kind of an aggregate. And these are dangerous things coming from an Austrian economist to say these things. But there's got to be like a social thinking. Like, most people have a certain framework they look from, they think of. And the idea is to somehow make an argument that sort of gets in past that framework. Maybe, and so a lot of people really get it once they understand that. But it's still, I think a lot of repetition is required. It probably, again, like the COVID, like a small doses are going to do it. You know, you're not going to get infected unless you and have symptoms, unless you get heavy doses or something like that. So it's, you know, how quickly we get out there and how much dosage. And then, you know, then there's the people, I would say the bottom 50%, which it's really going to be just very, very simple stuff. And they're just going to go along with whatever it is. So we don't have to convert I mean, you know, in one sense that's good. It's a little less daunting, but we're in the trenches now. We're doing that hand-to-hand combat, and you know. And you don't really know how long it's going to take or who comes up with the thing that makes an advance in communication or art. You know, that's the thing that is really needed, so that it just triggers in people. Hey, like, you know, most people now in the United States will say, you know, everybody has a right to a lawyer. I mean, you know, that's instinctual. That's where you want to get the idea of freedom, where everybody sort of, you know, no one is going to argue that you shouldn't have a lawyer. You know, that's just not going to happen in the United States. So you want that kind of idea about freedom to go out through the entire population. And go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to cut in there because it reminded me a little bit of, because a lot of people say, well, everyone has a right to healthcare or everyone has a right to house. And, you know, people, the problem with the right thing is people just start applying it everywhere. And one of the
I'm sorry. Did I even use, I mean, I tend to not use the term right. Did I said it? Yeah. Okay.
You did. But it raised an important point because,
which, by the way, I actually, from my private property perspective, no one has a right to a lawyer, but that's a general thinking now that almost everybody would agree to. But go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I understand that you understand negative rights, and that was just a Freudian slip on your part. Yeah. But I do speak to people that will say, like, you know, healthcare's a right and housing's a right and stuff. And I've had conversations where I said, well, it's not a right. But let me just clarify what I'm saying when I say it's not a right, because sometimes you say, well, healthcare's not a right. They sometimes say, you're saying people don't have a right to healthcare, like you're saying that they shouldn't be allowed to have healthcare, you know? And I'm saying, no, what it is, it's not a right, as in, like, you have a right, like, I mean, obviously the non-aggression principle and the self-ownership thing is only negative rights. You have a right to yourself, which means the only right you enforce on people is that they leave you alone. And the reason why that right is important is because there's doesn't create any positive obligation on anybody else. So you're not coercing anybody else. Now, as soon as you input any kind of positive right, anything that invokes, you know, whether it's a right to healthcare, right to housing, all this, anything that invokes other people's effort and labor, then you're saying that you have a right to something, so they're obliged to provide it. And that's when you get the analogies with slavery and stuff, because you're like, well, what right do you have to their labor, you know, which is a valid point. So what I try to do, and again, this is particularly when I'm speaking to left-wingers, is say, look, you don't have a right to healthcare, but that's not the same as saying that we shouldn't provide it to everybody. That's not, you know, it's the same. It's again the same with the lawyer thing, same with the house thing. I don't want anybody to be homeless. I don't want anybody to go out with healthcare. And this is where I can say I can certainly entertain the idea of being a part of some kind of system where I contribute to healthcare that also pays for people that can't contribute to it. You know, I'm not averse to those things. I'm averse to them under a coercive system. So what I can say to people is, look, you don't have a right to healthcare, but what we can do is create a society where we provide those things because we understand that, like, it's well, whether we do it out of compassion or whether we do it out of pure self-interest, because we understand that it's better for us to live in a society where people aren't suffering, particularly like from an economic point of view and all that, you know, like crime increases when people are in more desperate and poorer situations. So, you know, what I'm saying is there's incentives and there's ways in which we can create a system where we do provide for each other under a voluntary system. Now, it may well be that a lot of them are unnecessary, because under a truly free market where prices are able to be driven down through the competition, as well as efficacy and innovation and all the things that, you know, that percolate from that, it may well be that these social programs aren't necessary. But my point to the leftists isn't to convince them of that, because you won't convince them of that. You won't convince them to be capitalist, but what you will convince them to be, or not necessarily will, but you might convince them to do, is to be voluntary socialists as opposed to authoritarian socialists. And then once they've accepted voluntarism and voluntary socialists, then they'll be more open to free market options, because they've already accepted the voluntarist side of it. They've already accepted that basic principle. And now they're no longer just rejecting capitalism in some evil, which, I mean, again, this is the other problem with the left and right debate. Half the time they straw man each other anyway. Like, a lot of the times when leftists complain about capitalism, They don't complain about the capitalism that an anarcho-capitalist is advocating for. They complain about stuff that's got nothing to do with capitalism. That's like, you know, they'll say slavery was capitalism. They'll say burning down the rainforest is capitalism. They'll say that anything that's done by any crime, even if it's done directly by the government, they'll call it capitalism. They call the system we live in capitalism. You know what I mean? So to them, most of the time, they're just arguing against a straw man anyway. So you bring them out of that. You bring them out of that statist paradigm into a voluntarist paradigm without any attempt to even push them over to capitalism. Just let them stay into their little socialist bubble, but bring them into a voluntary version of it. Then when you've got them understanding self-ownership, the non-aggression principle and property rights, they might still be a socialist and pursue it, but at least they're doing it in a non-violent, non-threatening way that's not going to force you and your family to pay for it. Or they might be more open to being to seeing things how you see and see. You see what I'm saying? I like I say, it's theoretical. It's not going to be that easy in real life. But there's at least a foot in the door. I see. You know, I see there's a hold that I can grab onto and say, okay, I think I could get you. You know, I think I can bring you in.
Right. But yeah, no, I think. No, go ahead.
Oh no, one thing I did want to say, what you mentioned before, I even wrote it down so I wouldn't forget, was, because I think you're spot on this, is no one can do it all with regards to communicating this message. So I do think, and it's something I've even tried to do myself with regards to contacting other people, is like, just to use an example of someone relatively well known, you know Jordan Peterson, the well-known psychologist, I'm sure. Like, I might not be able to speak in a way to his audience that they'll understand and accept what I'm saying. But if I can convince him, then he can speak to his audience. So just like what you were saying, I might not be able to communicate to them, but if I can communicate to somebody who does, and that's the sort of thing that all of a sudden, this can go from something that's just, you know, me talking to a handful of people that are like-minded mostly, and a couple of people I encounter who aren't. It could go from that to something much bigger just through those kind of things. And those things may never happen, and that's why it might be pie in the sky. But if you did get those, I mean, I remember a friend of mine said, oh, you want to get on the Joe Rogan show? And I was like, well, to be honest, if I got on the Joe Rogan show, I consider it job done. Because, you know, once you've got that level exposure, particularly in a long form conversation where you're able to talk to somebody who's questioning you. And one of the reasons why I love having these conversations with different people is when I'm talking to, like I'm talking to you, somebody else that's listening to this conversation who would ask the same questions as you and stuff like that, I'm answering their questions as well as your, you know, and you get the same sort of thing. So if me or anybody else who was supporting this kind of idea got on something like the Joe Rogan show, that would be like a quantum leap forward with regards to the progress. And all of a sudden, something that seems very unlikely seems a hell of a lot more likely, because it's breached the awareness. I think half the battle is breaching people's awareness, because, like I say, a lot with these socialists, when I have the conversation with them about voluntarism, they're actually a lot more open to it than you'd think. But they haven't even been thinking about it. They haven't even been. They've never stepped outside the status bubble. So they just think, well, we live in a status system. What do I prefer? Capitalism, where the rich get richer, or socialism, where at least, even if it's imperfect and corrupt and full of bureaucratic mess, from their point of view, at least the people are getting something back. Whereas that's all of a sudden, the left-wing position seems a little bit more sympathetic when you kind of look at it from that angle. But then when you say, okay, well, let's agree that statism is wrong and this force and coercion is wrong, whichever banner you're doing it under, whether it's capitalism or socialism, whether it's left or right wing incarnations, let's get into a free society paradigm, a voluntarist society paradigm, which, as you say, it's not pie in the sky stuff with regards to the principle, you know, the ambition of making it how society is might be, but the principle, most of us learnt it around 5 or 6, not by that name, but the basic ethos of, you know, I mean, it's attached to all of our morality. You know, it's like when I was talking to someone about self-ownership the other day, and I said, look, self-ownership is one of those things that we all kind of accept inherently, but we've never really kind of brought it to the surface of our understanding, because if you think about it, it's in our language. If I talk about you, anything to do with you, I describe it as yours without even thinking about it. I talk about your eyes, your hair. Robert did this the other day. I talk about your actions. So there's almost an implicitness that I'm recognizing your self-ownership, because everything you do and say, I am describing as your words and actions. Right. So there's even an implicit understanding in our own language that we understand self-ownership. It's just about actualizing it. You could go up to a woman and say, look, obviously you agree that rape is wrong, but do you know why it's wrong? What's the principle behind it? Self-ownership. It's a violation of self-ownership. Same for murder, same for robbery, same for destruction of property, same for assault, same for slavery, same for ruling people, statism as a whole. And, you know, so it's almost like I just want to shine the light on a principle that most people accept anyway, even though we don't kind of realize it. And if we shine a light on that, I think people's own morality will almost do the rest to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. But getting back to the Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan point you made, in the United States, when Ron Paul ran for president and really stuck to a libertarian position, I think he probably increased the libertarian community by about 30% in the United States. It was that important. So it is very, very important to get on platforms that that can get the word out. That's extremely, extremely important. And the trick is, you know, how to do that and just keep on plugging away at it, you know. And actually, you know, I find this COVID-19 and lockdowns and all that, you know, as I mentioned to you in the email when we talked a couple of weeks back, you know, I'm getting a lot more requests for interviews and things like that, and I can see traffic increasing to my blog sites, and you know, people are much more interested in trying to understand what's going on with government and what it means in relation to them. So we might have a little bit of an opportunity at this time that's a little bigger than normal.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, because on the other hand, the other sort of side of that is, like I say, the increased dependency and a lot of the increased authoritarian.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, there's no question. It's not a good thing for most people, but to the degree that we can catch more ears, I think there's the potential for that. I mean, there's a lot of people that we've lost. You know, there's no way we're going to convert them to freedom at this point. I mean, we really need that masses of secondhand dealers, third-hand dealers that go out there and convert. But this also got to be like, to use this from you know, the COVID-19 analogy again. You know, there's got to be super spreaders out there too, that can sort of really get the information out there. And the more exposure that we have to other people, the larger the audience is, the better. The better it is. I mean, the more chance we have of reaching people who can help us get our ideas out there and develop it on their own, or just get more exposure for us. So.
Yeah, and like you say, it's about, and also about those different people that can speak to different people. I mean, I think I can perhaps speak to more people than maybe your average anarcho-capitalist, because I'm a little bit more sympathetic to some left-wing principles. So I can speak to them in a way where I can kind of relate, and I've got some common ground where I can kind of bring them in. Whereas, like, I mean, one of the reasons why I took this tack with the left a lot as well was, I mean, I'm a member of a group called ANCOM versus ANCAP debate group. Now, the so-called, yeah, it's like anarchist capitalist, anarchist communist kind of thing. Now, the anarchist communists are not anarchists at all. They're just communists. They don't have any respect for freedom at all. But when I have, I mean, I say they don't. There are some that are an exception, but generally speaking, when I first joined the group, I thought ANCAP and COM, I thought they would both be voluntarists, like what I'm talking about. You know, I thought they'd both be voluntarists, and I thought one would just prefer the free market model, and one would want to go for communal models. but they would both be voluntarists. But when I kind of encountered the commies, I realized they're just commies. They want to seize private property. They don't respect, they want to ban employment, all this nonsense. But a lot of the times when they were having debates with capitalists, they would just be arguing about the merits and the pros and the cons of the economic models. Which, don't get me wrong, it's not like it's a waste of time conversation, because it is a debate that needs to be had and something that many of them could do with educating on. But the problem is there was no headway being made. So I kind of took the different tact. And whenever they kind of said, oh, well, look at all this exploitation and stuff, the problem is a lot of the ANCAPs would try to justify. Sometimes they justify things that they shouldn't even be justifying. Like, like you'd hear like commies say, well, what about all the land that was taken from the Native Americans and stuff? And instead of sort of saying, look, that was nothing to do with us, property rights can still be respected going forward, even if it was violated in the past kind of thing. But instead, some of them will try to defend it and say, oh, well, they didn't really have proper property, or, or they were savages or whatever. And, I mean, and you're getting nowhere. And all they're doing is further increasing the opinion, or lowering the opinion that the other side has of them, because they're just further confirming their theories about what a contemptible person the other side is. I don't go with none of that. I say, yeah, no, that's wrong, but that changes nothing. And here's why it's wrong. It's a violation of self-ownership. And that same self-ownership is why people shouldn't be forced to be part of your program. It's like I say, I take their own principle and kind of use it against them, if you like, and I do I do the same thing with some ANCAPs, because there are ANCAPs I've spoken to that are a little bit selective. They're not the most consistent. And sometimes, so I'll use their own principle. Like, some people have defended a lot of arbitrary land ownership claims, like where like massive areas of like lakes and forests that are owned, whether it's by an estate or a government or whatever. And I just say, well, that's not rightful ownership. That's not the same as building a property and having a property. And obviously that would give you dominion of the land where your property is. But your property rights stem from your creation of property, not just by arbitrarily pointing out a massive amount of land and saying, that's mine. Or through the conquest that it was originally achieved. So when a left wing is complaining about something like that, I could say, yeah, you're right. But the reason you're right is not because property is theft and all this nonsense. The reason you're right is that the property rights you reject are violated in that instance, because that ownership claim is arbitrary and is not consistent with property rights. And you show them that some of the valid complaints they have, and there are some sprinkled amongst all their madness, there is some valid points. You have to hunt to find them a bit. So what I do is I take those valid points, I give them the credit for it, and say, yeah, you're right about that. But why are you right about that? And I pull the principle out and I show them the principle that they themselves supported, and then I point out that the principle that underpins their morality is the same principle that underpins the morality on the other side that they're rejecting. And like I say, it's not a guarantee, but I think if you're going to get through to anybody, then what you've got to do is you've got to find the part of them that does recognize freedom. There is a part in almost everybody, and then just show them how they need to apply the same principle consistently. So
is this locally where you live, the NCAMP, or how does
no, it's an internet, it's like a Facebook group sort of thing. So there's people from all over the world and that. And I mean, you don't just get ANCOMs and ANCAPs on there. You get some people on there that are statists, some people that are cool.
Now, what about in your neck of the woods? What are there many anarcho-capitalists or libertarians or anything like that, or do you?
Where I live, no, I don't know anybody other than the people I've personally converted. I don't know anybody that even identifies as libertarian, let alone anarchist or anarcho-capitalist or anything like that. They either don't vote and are just totally disinterested in politics entirely, or they begrudgingly, unenthusiastically will vote for one side or the other because they're either left wing or right wing. Like the left wingers will vote for Labour, not because they particularly like Labour, but just because they hate the Tories more. And a lot of the right wingers don't particularly like the Tories, or the Conservative Party as they're otherwise known. Because over here, Labour is our left wing party, the equivalent to the Democrats over there, and the Conservative Party were called the Tories. And most right-wingers don't like the conservatives because they know they're not really conservatives. They're kind of fake versions, just like the Republicans in America. And a lot of but their support for their respective party is not so much an enthusiasm for them, but more that they hate the others. It's a lesser evil thing, basically. I think that's often been the case with a lot of politicians. A little bit different with Trump, because a lot of his supporters are quite fanatic and almost sycophantic in many areas. But generally speaking, like a lot of the people that are supporting Biden are doing so they kind of know that he's not great, but they hate Trump more, and it's kind of that attitude, So again, there's plenty of it's not like you have to fight a lot of enthusiasm for the government when you're addressing either party. They both kind of recognize it to a certain degree. They don't see any other option. They're stuck in their statist paradigm, and they're stuck with this view that they either have nothing to do with it and ignore it, which is the choice a lot of people make. Most people I know don't vote or have anything to do with politics at all, and they just don't see the point, which I can understand. And I don't vote myself, but for different reasons.
Right. Yeah.
But the people I do know that vote, that none of them do it enthusiastically. And I know people that vote for either side, and they both have the same thing. They're like, well, they're not great, but the others are worse. And I'm like, well, how about, here's a crazy idea. How about I know it's not going to happen tomorrow, but how about you put your effort into looking into something that's not just the lesser evil, something that's not any kind of evil, something that's actually moral and good and logically consistent. And as I say, it's not I'm not building an army of followers, but slowly but surely, on a one-to-one basis at least, I am sort of people. And I mean, I like doing it because even where I struggle, even where I get resistance, it helps me because it helps me work on my ability to communicate the message. And the more sometimes the tough conversations I've had have been better for me with regards to improving my communication ability than the easy conversations. Because when I've had an easy conversation with someone where they're like they got it all immediately, that hasn't really. I'm not a better communicator at the end of it, even though I've had success with that person. Whereas when I've had someone that's been really difficult and I'm like, why aren't they getting what I'm saying? And so I'm trying it from different angles. And then I find an angle that does resonate with them. Now I've got a bigger arsenal of ways in which I know that I can reach people, So, but no matter how much, and I'm not the greatest communicator in the world, but it obviously is something that I'm trying to improve. But no matter how well I do that, you are correct that no one can reach everybody. And that is why the whole idea of, like you say, collaborating and reaching other people who themselves can then, that's what I want to do. I don't want everyone to follow me. I want other people to get onto this idea and be advocates of it themselves in the same way that I am, because I'm not, I wouldn't be in charge. It's a leaderless movement in the sense of no one would be in charge. But we can all get behind the principle. The principle would be in charge, And so I just think that, if again, it's unlikely, but if I was to speak to someone like Jordan Peterson, I just think to myself, right, I no longer need to try and get his audience. I just need to get him, because he can get his audience probably better than I can anyway, and the same with all sorts of different characters. I mean, funnily enough, Jordan Peterson is probably not the best example, because I probably fancy my chances more with his audience than I would with other audiences, because I think they would at least be more open to some of the ideas. But I still think they're more likely to listen to it from him than they are me, because they respect him, and I think, like I say, it's not likely stuff, but my conviction behind it, which kind of keeps me going, is as unlikely as it is. If it's gonna happen, this is how we do it. Like if we're going to unite people left and right on a common ground, then that common ground is going to be voluntarism. And I'm not saying we're going to do it, but I just think that's the only banner that we could do it, even theoretically, because everything else we are far apart. And that's why I say, that's why I'm not trying to convert the socialists to capitalists or vice versa. I'm just trying to convert the statists to voluntarists, and then create a different paradigm for the conversation of economics to take place under.
I don't really have objections with that. I mean, some of the examples you gave they make a lot of sense, how you have approached people and all that, and sort of taking what they think and using it against them. That's really Very, very powerful stuff. So I think it works. I mean, I don't think there's just one way to do it, but I think your way is powerful. And you know, the more you can do with that, the more exposure you get. I think the better off it is. The more exposure I get, the better off it is. You know, we're all
doing our bit.
Yeah. So good. And so we're past the 2-hour mark, I think.
Probably a good time to wrap it up. Been a great conversation. Happily have another one.
As always, thank you. Yeah. Really enjoyed it. So, you know, we should do these more often. You know,
Yeah, definitely. Like I say, I enjoy these conversations because it helps. I mean, in addition to helping me communicate the ideas and obviously have people to bounce them off and get feedback and all the rest of it,
right.
But it also helps me think through the ideas because I often find, I don't know if you find this as well, but thinking things in your own mind is one thing, but thinking things out loud in a conversation with somebody else, because you've got another mind that you can utilize and bounce off. And it's almost like, I don't think I'm just talking to you. I'm actually thinking as I'm talking to you and developing.
Yeah. I absolutely. I agree. I mean, you know, writing does that, but also when you're in conversations with other people, it does something that causes you to think in a different way, where you're developing your thoughts in much more detail. You know, it's very, very, very important. So I think what might make sense is whenever there's like a hot topic, you know, we should get together. I mean, right now it's obviously COVID-19, and we discussed a lot about that. So that's like a good jumping off point. So when the next big one comes, we should do this again.
Well, the way this year's gone, it won't be too long before the next big event.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for an alien invasion because I don't know what's going to top the next thing.
Yeah. Who knows? I mean, it's crazy. So anyways, good. Really appreciate, Matthew. Good talking to you. And, you know, we'll talk to you during the next crisis or whatever that comes up. How's that?
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, before you go, do you want to just, to people that are listening to this, just tell them where to go to find out more information about your work?
The best place to go is my website called economicpolicyjournal.com. And there's actually a shortcut. You can go to epj.cloud/epj. No .com, epj.cloud/epj, or just go economicpolicyjournal.com. I've also got the new podcast that I've just launched, which is called This Week in Economics with Robert Wenzel, and you can get that at any podcast platform. If you have a platform where you're not getting it for whatever reason, let me know, and I'll try and make sure we get it on that platform. So
okay. Well, if you want to give me the links to that, I'll put them in the description as well. So then people can just click on it. It's always easier than writing down things on that. So anyone who wants to check out more of Robert's work, there'll be links in the description of this video, and also links to the Nations of Sanity website as well if you want to check out my project. And I just want to say thank you to Robert, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, Matthew.